The collision of cultures. In this unit of study, the United States history student will understand how the age of exploration impacted Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Columbus was an Italian who was educated in seamanship in Portugal. He persuaded King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to finance his trip across the Atlantic Ocean, searching for a western passage to Asia. The voyage began on August 3, 1492. Columbus and his crew set sail with 3 ships, the famous Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. They sighted land on October 12th and landed in the Bahamas and other islands in the Caribbean. Columbus was convinced that he had landed at an island off the coast of Asia, but he certainly met some people known as Tanos in the Caribbean island. He mistakenly thought they were from Asia and named them Indians, and the name would stick. There were 4 voyages that Columbus would undertake. The first one, he would also explore the Bahamas before discovering and exploring Cuba. After exploring Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, the flagship was wrecked and a post was established at La Navidad because it happened on Christmas Day. Men were left behind when he returned home by 15th March after stopping the Azores and in Lisbon. In a second voyage that set out on September 25th, 1493 to June 11th, 1496, sailing from Cadiz with 17 ships and 1,200 men, including his brother Diego. When Columbus returned to Navidad on November 27, 1493, he found it burned to the ground, nobody in the vicinity. In the fields nearby, however, he discovered the bodies of 8 Christians. He abandoned the area and explored the Leeward Islands in Puerto Rico before discovering the destruction of the original post. A second post was established at Isabella on January 2, 1494, on Santo Domingo. Additional exploration occurred on Santo Domingo, Jamaica, and Hispaniola. Isabella was abandoned and the city of Santo Domingo was established in 1496. Columbus left a second brother, Bartholomew, in charge of the island before returning to Spain on March 10, 1496, arriving in Cadiz on June the 11th. His third voyage set out on May 30th, 1498 to 25 November 1500, this time with 7 ships. Columbus left for Santo Domingo, dividing his fleet at the Canaries. He sighted South America before arriving at Santo Domingo on 31 August. The colony was in a state of rebellion. Spain's new governor, Francisco de Bobadilla, arrived on 23 August and sent 3 brothers Columbus to Spain in chains in October. Although restored to their honors, they never regained their authority, which was retained by the Spanish crown. His final voyage, from May 1502 to November 1504, he only had 4 ships, and he left Cadiz and landed at Martinique on June 15th. He later sailed to Honduran coast and explored to the south as far as central Panama. He was shipwrecked and marooned in Jamaica for 12 months before he was finally rescued and returned home. The Columbia Exchange. The 2 continents were very dissimilar in the manner of plants, animals, devices, and diseases. After Columbus's trips to Americas, future voyages participated in a sustained cultural, disease, and good exchange between the Old and New World that has become known as the Columbia Exchange. Animals new to the Old World, including the flying squirrel, iguana, catfish, rattlesnake, and armadillo. Animals new to the New World included horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. Plants new to the Old World included corn, potatoes, peanuts, peppers, chocolate, tobacco, and pumpkins. Plants new to the New World included coffee, olives, wheat, sugarcane, and rice. Devices and substances new to the Old World included canoes, snowshoes, hammocks, certain hallucinogenic substances used in Native American religious ceremonies, and the game of lacrosse. Devices and substances new to the New World include the use of wheeled carts drawn by horses, firearms, tobacco, and several drugs. Diseases new to the New World included smallpox, bubonic plague, malaria, and yellow fever. The transmission of these diseases killed more Native Americans than any other event. Scholars estimated that the infectious diseases brought by the Europeans and enslaved Africans killed up to 80 to 90% of the American native population. Spanish Florida. Juan Ponce de Leon in 1513 established a short-lived colony in the Carolina coast and explored and named Florida Pascua de la Florida, the Festival of Flowers, because he found it on Easter Sunday. Panfilo de Narvaez explored from Florida to the Mississippi River, although he drowned at sea in the process. Hernando de Soto traveled across much of present-day America south and then up the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers. He, too, would die during the exploration. French Huguenots, or French Protestant exiles, built a fort in present-day Jacksonville named Fort Caroline. Pedro Menendez de Avilés was dispatched by the Spanish crown and a group of 1,500 soldiers and colonists and established St. Augustine in northern Florida, partly in response to the threats of the French Huguenots, Protestant Calvinists, colonizing the region to protect Spanish settlements. St. Augustine was established in 1565, is the longest surviving permanent European settlement in the present-day United States. De Avilés was successful in defeating and driving out the French. English exploration in America. Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh. Gilbert secured a patent to establish a colony in the New World. After 2 failed attempts, he was lost at sea, and his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, established a colony in present-day North Carolina. The expedition searched the North American mainland, which he dubbed Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. They spied on Spanish defenses in the Caribbean and landed on Roanoke Island before returning to England. The first attempt established the colonizing party in April of 1585 to Roanoke Island, leaving Lane in charge. The colonists abandoned the area in June of 1586. Returning to England with Sir Francis Drake, Grenville returned with supplies to find the colony abandoned and left 15 men. The lost colony at Roanoke. Another expedition under John White arrived in July in 1587 and found no survivors, leaving another group of colonists. White returned to England 1 week after his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who was born on August 18th, the first English child to be born in the New World. Unable to return until August of 1590 due to the Spanish Armada, White found no trace of the colonists except for the letters Croatan carved in a tree, the name of a neighboring tribe. A final expedition dispatched in March of 1602 made a futile search for survivors. None was found. Recent evidence has revealed that the colony experienced a severe drought during the time he was gone. And so ends the first unit on the clash of cultures. Unit of study will focus on the development of England's colonies in North America. The Glorious Revolution. After James II angered Parliament in 1688, Parliament invited James' Protestant daughter from his first marriage, Mary Stuart, and her husband, William III, the Prince of Orange, to jointly rule the throne. This was termed the Glorious Revolution, as Parliament succeeded in winning its freedom from the Crown and establishing itself as an independent and equal institution. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 improved on the Magna Carta's limitations of the power of the monarchy. William and Mary recognized in their coronation oath that Parliament as the leading power in ruling England. This was the trade-off. In order for them to come back, they had to agree to the English Bill of Rights, which included no suspending of parliamentary laws, no levying of taxes without the consent of Parliament, no interfering with members' freedom of speech in Parliament, no penalty from a citizen who petitions the king for grievances, no standing armies to be kept in peacetime, no excessive bails in court or cruel and unusual punishment. The king could not be a Roman Catholic, Every Englishman was given a right to trial by jury. If a treason trial, it must produce 2 eyewitnesses. Perhaps most important for the British people and future American colonists was that no taxes were allowed to be levied without the consent of Parliament. In the Act of Settlement, if no heir between William or Anne, Mary died in 1694, the throne would pass to the Elector Dowager of Hanover, granddaughter of James I. In the Act of Union, England and Scotland united to become one kingdom and therefore will be referred to as Great Britain. Virginia. The Virginia colony was established in 1607 when settlers traveled up the James River, which they named, and settled inland to hide their colony from Spanish and other forces that arrived via the sea. They named this settlement Jamestown after King James I. As this Virginia company was expected to turn a profit to their investors, the majority of settlers who arrived were more interested in discovering gold than planting. This led to hard times in the first winter. Jamestown is the oldest continuous English settlement in the present-day United States. The starving years. When the colonists arrived, they began to settle Jamestown. They were ill-prepared and quarrelsome, expected to find gold, friendly Indians, and easy living. Instead, they found disease, prolonged drought, starvation, violence, and death. Most of the settlers had no idea how to farm or were gentlemen who despised any kind of manual labor. Of the 105 that arrived, in 9 months, only 38 had survived. John Smith, who rose in leadership among the colony and eventually enacted a policy that dictated that only those who worked would be provided food. He who shall not work shall not eat. The Powhatan Confederacy, or the Indians of the area, known as the Powhatans, were led by Chief Powhatan. He established trade with Jamestown and helped keep the colonists alive for the first winter. In reinforcement attempts, more settlers, including several women, arrived at Jamestown from England in 1609 and 1610. Over the next few years, a series of revisions were made to the charter to make the colony more effective and help it grow. Finally, in 1612, tobacco was discovered to be a profitable export, and the colony began to experience a dramatic rise in its fortunes. By the 1620s, the colony was shipping 50,000 pounds of tobacco each year. By 1670, Virginia and Maryland exported 15 billion pounds of tobacco a year. Tobacco on a large scale did require more laborers in the field. Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon. Berkeley was a royal governor of Virginia and was not well liked. He used his authority to help the rich at the expense of the poor. After a battle between natives and colonists, in which Bacon's overseer was killed, Berkeley ruled that no more land could be open to settlement. Nathaniel Bacon of Henrico County, without commission, led several frontiersmen against bands of renegade Sesquowank Indians, on which he was declared a traitor in May of 1676. Bacon then led 500 against Jamestown unopposed, forcing Governor Berkeley to sign his commission. Berkeley could not raise sufficient forces against Bacon and fled east to the shore. Large plantation owners supported Bacon, who continued to make retaliatory raids against the Indians before driving Berkeley's forces out of Jamestown. After Bacon died suddenly of dysentery on 18th of October, rebel forces were captured or surrendered under promise of amnesty. Colonel Herbert Jeffreys was sent to restore order, but his royal pardons for the rebels were nullified by Berkeley, and on February 10, 1677, 23 rebels were executed before Jeffreys formally took over the government. Settling New England. New England colonies were mostly founded by settlers who paid their own way to establish themselves in the New World. Very few were indentured servants. The soil in New England was not as conducive to cultivation, nor the growing season. Most of the early settlers did so purely for religious reasons. They wished to worship how and when they pleased, and usually settled with like-minded individuals. When Puritan separatists wished to leave England and settle in the Americas, King James I was more than happy to oblige them. The Plymouth Colony was settled by the Pilgrims, who were the most radical sect of the Puritans. They believed that the Church of England still retained too many Catholic institutions, and they needed to be purified. Eventually, they would cross the Atlantic to escape persecution in 1620. On the voyage, they crafted the Mayflower Compact to govern their lives and their settlement. The Mayfire Compact was a covenant, a group contract, signed by the men of the colony that formed a civil body politic that was supposed to be based on just and civil laws. In early Plymouth, only male property-owning church members were allowed to participate in the government and to vote. They arrived in the middle of winter and settled in a former Wampanoag village whose residents had died of smallpox. By spring, they were reduced to half their number. Squanto, a local Indian man who had learned English in Europe when he was captured and enslaved, but who returned to find his village depleted by disease, taught the colonists how to grow and gather food in the area. Early peace with the Wampanoags helped Plymouth survive. Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans believed that the Church of England needed to be purified of any Catholic remnants left over by the Reformation. In 1629, Charles I granted a charter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony to allow Puritans led by John Winthrop to settle in the New World. Using a technicality, Winthrop headquartered the company in the colony itself, a revolutionary idea at the time. Winthrop and other Puritan leaders wanted the colony to become a model Christian community, a city upon a hill. They hoped that this model would then be taken back to England to be used for governing. The Puritan leaders of Massachusetts Bay worked to ensure that everyone in the colony became or remained Puritan. So despite that they escaped England for religious freedom, they denied that same religious freedom to others. They did not attempt to extend religious toleration or political freedom. Instead, they attempted to convince others to become more like the Puritan leaders themselves. Catholics, Anglicans, Quakers, and Baptists were punished, imprisoned, banished, and sometimes executed. The Restoration in the Colonies. Charles II granted the area that is now North and South Carolina to a group of 8 lord proprietors who had exclusive ownership. They named their colony Carolina, after Charles, from the Latin Carolinia. Barbados had developed a hugely profitable sugar plantation system based on the hard labor of enslaved Africans. By 1670, Barbados had 25,000 whites and more than 35,000 enslaved Africans. The mortality rate for slaves was twice that in Virginia, and land was scarce, so the chance to settle in the Carolinas was very promising. And the first English colonists in South Carolina arrived in 1669 at Charlestown. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina were written by proprietor Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper and his secretary John Locke, who provided for a formal titled nobility and awarded large land grants to wealthy English nobles. Head rights, or land grants, were given to every immigrant who paid his or her passage. Religious toleration to Christians, Jews, and so-called heathens were also granted. North Carolina was first settled by settlers of Virginia who had drifted south. The colony was named Albemarle, and it was settled in the 1650s. It gained a governor in 1664 and an assembly in 1665. Pine resin was used to make tar for ships, hence the name Tar Heels. And South Carolina became a royal colony in 1719. It was a slave-based colony, prospered by growing sugar cane and rice and wealthy English planters from Barbados. Pennsylvania was formed by William Penn and his Quaker followers. Unlike Winthrop, Penn encouraged members of all denominations, those who professed belief in Jesus' deity, to move to his colony. Quakers were radical Protestants who rebelled against all political and religious authority. They were founded in 1647 by George Fox. They refused to show deference to religious or political leaders, insisted on religious freedom for all, argued for the equality of the sexes, and denied the authority of religious creeds, rituals, and ordained ministers. In addition, their pacifism, the refusal to fight, seemingly odd behaviors, and outspoken beliefs were viewed by others as threatening to the social and religious order. By the end of 1681, thousands of immigrants had responded to Penn's offer, and a bustling town emerged that Penn would call Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Relations between the Native Americans and the Pennsylvania Quakers was very good due to Penn's policy of purchasing the land from the Native Americans. This will cause a lasting peace for 50 years. Penn's frame of government resembled that of other proprietary colonies. The governor had no veto, although Penn's proprietor did. It was Penn's hope that the government could not be run on Quaker principles. Delaware was also given to Penn to create another colony. In 1704, it would choose its own assembly, but share the same governor. So therefore, the only proprietary colonies that were owned by individuals starting out were Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Slavery in the colonies. In 1700, enslaved Africans made up 11% of the total population in the American colonies. Slavery was much more common in the Chesapeake colonies in the Carolinas. By 1770, enslaved Africans made up almost 20% of the population. Most enslaved Africans brought from Africa to the Americas went to the Caribbean islands and Portuguese Brazil. In the English colonies, such as Virginia and Maryland, however, the enslaved African population became self-sustaining as the children of slaves became the next generation of slaves. The slaves who came to the Americas were mostly war prisoners of a different tribe, sold off for money by the victors of battle. Slavery in Africa was less brutal than in the Americas. Whereas slavery in Africa was often the result of capture and warfare, slavery in America became race-based, especially after laws were passed that declared children born to enslaved women to be slaves themselves. Colonial ways of life. Trade, as they were primarily involved in providing England with raw materials and not the manufacture of finished goods, New Englanders had to import these items from the mother country. By using their own ships, they were able to transfer a burgeoning shipping industry into an economic juggernaut for the colonies. Trade in New England and the middle colonies differed from that in the South. New England's lack of staple crops to exchange for English goods was a relative disadvantage, but to the success of shipping commercial enterprise worked in their favor. After 1660, the English government placed taxes on fish, flour, wheat, and meat, while leaving the door open to high-demand products such as timber, furs, and whale oil between 1698 and 1717. New England and New York purchased more than they exported, creating an unfavorable balance of trade. The triangular trade between New England's merchant ships run to the west coast of Africa, in which they would exchange it for slaves. Then the same ships would bring back the slaves to the Caribbean islands to sell, and the ships would return home from the Caribbean with various commodities, including molasses, which New Englanders made into rum. Puritanical Puritans. Contrary to public perception now, the Puritans were not the dour and tolerant individuals that they are portrayed in the media. They were moderates who believed that anything done to excess, except for piety, was problematic, although they did ban card playing, dancing, swearing, and celebrating Christmas. Drinking was allowed, but those who drank too much and became drunks had to wear a D in public. The Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican Church of any Catholic remnants, and they believed they had entered into a covenant with God based on John Calvin's teachings. Although many teachings of Calvin promoted the concept of democracy, it did not invade Puritan politics. As the population of the colonies increased in New England, so did the strains between the differing immigrant groups. As the merchants continued to import goods from England, materialism began to take an effect and weaken the emphasis on the church that had existed previously. In Salem and other towns in Essex County, Massachusetts, during the period of 1692 through 1693, there's going to be witch trials. Before the outbreaks of the accusation in 1692, however, about 300 New Englanders had been accused and more than 30 had been hanged for practicing witchcraft. This all began when several preteen girls became fascinated with the tales told by Tibita, a slave from Barbados, and they started to behave very oddly and blamed three women, Tibita, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborn. During the trial, Tibita would confess that she no longer could see. What that meant is that she was saved and she could no longer see the influence of Satan. Good and Osborne would not confess, claiming they were innocent, and because they wouldn't confess, they would be hanged for witchcraft. Then the girls began to point out other suspect witches based on spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is where the girls said they could see Satan standing by the accused in the form of a wolf, a yellow sparrow, and so forth. Even though no one else could see it, it was allowed in the courts. When it was all said and done, a total of 19 people were executed for refusing to confess to practicing witchcraft. Over 150 others confessed and were sentenced to jail. Within a year, the Massachusetts Bay Colony governor disbanded the special court that had tried these accused of witchcraft, mainly because he was almost next in line to being accused. The remaining suspects were released. Today, scholars differ in which the explanations what happened in Salem and Essex County, but generally acknowledge the social, cultural, and sometimes economic context in the area that may have led to the outbreak of accusations and convictions of witchcraft. Slavery in the colonies. African slaves were a significant part of the economy in the Dutch colony in New Amsterdam, later known as New York City. Racial prejudice was so deeply ingrained into the 17th century colonists that it was perceived as a way of living in the imperfect world. It is important to remember that the color of a person's skin, not the status of his or her mother, was the indicator whether he or she would be a slave. Africans and Indians, being darker of skin than the colonists, were made slaves. People of European descent were not. During the 18th century, the demand for slaves soared in the southern colonies. The emphasis on staple crops such as rice, indigo, tobacco, and sugarcane led to an increased demand for slaves in the British North American colonies. Although the number and percentage of enslaved persons in these colonies never approached that of the Caribbean islands colonies or South and Central American colonies, the emphasis on race-based slavery deeply impacted the enslaved Africans and African Americans in these colonies. By 1750, there were almost 250,000 slaves in British America. Whereas English immigrants had formed 90% of British North American colonies, populations in the 17th century, the number of enslaved Africans brought as captives against their will surpassed all other immigrant groups in the 18th century. During the late 17th century, the probability of African slavery led to the emergence of a dozen new slave trading companies both in Europe and America. The American colonies preferred slaves as they're viewed as property, with no civil rights, and their offspring could also become slaves. Another important factor for the colonists, they could not easily escape like the Indians and blend in. The market in slaves. Once the slave ship arrived, the Africans would be auctioned to the highest bidder. They are forbidden to speak their native language, practice religion, or sustain their culture. Majority worked from dawn to dusk. By 1750, 150,000 slaves lived in British America, and a vast majority of 150,000 lived in Virginia and Maryland, and 60,000 in South Carolina and Georgia, the rest throughout the rest of the colonies. Enslaved men and women of African descent in the American colonies performed a variety of tasks. Most worked in agriculture, on plantations, or on large or family farms. Others gained more specialized skills such as blacksmithing, carpentry, and midwifery. Resistance. Slaves did not accept their legal condition as property passively. Although outright organized rebellion was rare, enslaved men and women resisted and rebelled in more subtle ways. In some cases, they stole themselves by escaping and running away. One of the largest slave rebellions in colonial America took place on September 9, 1739, in Stono, South Carolina. Although initially successful, most of the rebels were captured on their way to Spanish Florida and were killed. The violence of this rebellion increased slaveholders' fear of death at the hand of their slaves, leading to passage of stiffer laws regulating slave activities and punishment of slaves who rebelled. Slaves in New York City. Slaves in the Middle and New England colonies were more likely to live in towns or cities. New York City had more slaves than any other city in colonial America, and by 1740 was second only to Charlestown. In 1712, several dozen slaves revolted, and the militia would catch 27 of the rebels. 6 would commit suicide, the rest would be executed. Some were even burned alive. New York officials passed black codes to regulate slave behavior. In the conspiracy of 1741, in March, Mary Burton, a white indentured servant, told authorities that there would be an uprising led by John Houston, a white trafficker in stolen goods. He denied it, but was still convicted and hanged within 2 weeks. Half the adult male slave population in the city were in jail, which would be called the conspiracy of 1741, which ended when 17 slaves and 4 whites were hanged. 13 more blacks were burned at the stake. A master could get away with murder of his own slave. The Great Awakening. The Great Awakening in mid-18th century was the first popular movement among the colonies before the Revolution that spanned all 13. Most colonies had an established church, that is, one in which the colonial government endorsed one official religious denomination. In these colonies, some taxes went towards supporting the established church, and the local parish usually became the center of religious life. When itinerant revivalist preachers came to the colonies with established churches, they had to seek permission from the parish. Their message tended to be emotionally charged and emphasized the need of individuals to be reborn as Christians. As revival spread, denominations such as Baptists and Methodists attracted followers. Jonathan Edwards traveled the colonies preaching sermons on renouncing materialism, the Enlightenment, and the need to return to the faith. His highly charismatic preaching and vivid descriptions riveted audiences and helped convince them for the need for spiritual revival in their lives. Although it was just one of many, Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God became his most famous sermon. From colonies to states, competition wars among Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands in Europe often impacted their North American colonies. As Spanish and Dutch power decreased, conflicts between England and France and their colonies predominated. Throughout these conflicts, Native Americans became involved as well, whether through alliances with one of the European powers or their own logical or regional conflicts. Warfare in the colonies. After the Restoration, both Charles II and James II pursued a policy of friendship with the French king Louis XIV. When William I and Mary became the joint monarchs of England, William brought with his coronation England's involvement in European wars. Over the next several decades, war erupted in Europe. and in the New World on 4 separate occasions. 3 of these were but sideshows in America, with little involvement of the colonies. First, there was King William's War from 1689 to 1697, the first Anglo-French conflict in North America. The Americans faced the Europeans' war, which in Europe was called the League of Osborn. This ended in a negotiated peace and reestablished a balance of power between England and France. Queen Anne's War. The American phase, 1702 to 1713, of Europe's War of Spanish Succession. At its conclusion, England would gain Nova Scotia from France. Following the conclusion of Queen Anne's War would begin the Golden Age of piracy, from about 1712 to almost 1725. During the War of Queen Anne, Great Britain had hired privateers and licensed armed vessels allowed to attack ships in which the nation was at war. When the war ended, you had almost 10,000 sailors now unemployed, and the only trade they knew was basically piracy. Well, the well-known pirates of this time would be Charles Vane, Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, and Bartholomew Roberts. They would cause problems with all the maritime nations, including the British colonies, and by 1725 the age of piracy was over, when the maritime nations ganged up and put the pirates out of business. Then there was King George's War, 1739 to 1754, the Third Anglo-French War in North America. Part of the European conflict known as the War of Austrian Succession. New Englanders had captured the French fortress of Louisbourg, only to have it returned to France after the peace negotiations, which had strong repercussions. The colonists were outraged that what they won had been given back to France. The English were equally outraged by New York's illegal trade with the French while the war was going on. The French had tried to halt colonial expansion of trade and their Indian allies by building a series of forts in the Ohio Valley. The French and Indian War. The Fourth Anglo-Franco War, the French and Indian War, as we shall see, was the exception to the rule. It began when the British colonists crossed into the Ohio River Valley, with both England and France had claimed. In response, the French erected forts in the western Pennsylvania to prevent further intrusion. George Washington, a member of Virginia's colonial militia, was sent with a small force to ask them to leave. When they refused, he was sent back with a larger force in 1754, when his militia unit killed 10 French soldiers outside the newly erected French Fort Duquesne, which is in modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Washington and his men then quickly built a small circular stockade they named Fort Necessity in preparation for a counterattack by the French. They surrendered after the defeat by the French on July 3rd and 4th, 1754, in the Battle of Great Meadows. This began as a war between England and France and their North American colonies and Native American allies. That's why it was called the French and Indian War, due to the Delaware and the Shawnees allying themselves with the French. The Albany Plan of Union. Benjamin Franklin's extortion to the colonies to unite against the French in 1754 would be popular again 20 years later when the colonies faced a different threat. The Albany Plan of Union called to discuss the mutual plans for defense. The Albany Congress accomplished nothing except the introduction of Franklin's Plan of Union. This plan called for the creation of a confederation of the colonies, which would be overseen by a chief executive appointed by the Crown and a legislative body chosen by colonial assemblies. The plan was rejected by the participants at the Albany Congress, but it was a forerunner of what would become the Articles of Confederation. In London, the government decided that there would be a showdown in America. The British Navy was dispatched to the French colony of Nova Scotia, where they overpowered the French forts protecting Acadia and then expelled 11,500 French Catholic residents, many who became known as Cajuns, when they moved to French Louisiana. The Battle of Quebec.
The war reached its zenith at the Battle of Quebec, where French forces were able to capture the city and crush the French control of their colonies in the New World forevermore. The British, under General Wolfe, with 4,500 troops, landed with a successful assault above Quebec on the Plains of Abraham. They had actually taken longboats past the city, climbed up the cliff, and the French would find now they were blocked in front of the St. Lawrence River to their front, and now the British to the rear. They engaged the French forces under Mattacombe of 3,000 troops and forced Quebec surrender by September. Both military leaders, Wolfe and Mattacombe, were killed. The British forces were able to control other colonies in the New World forevermore. In the Treaty of Paris, the victorious Britain took all of France's North American provinces from the Mississippi River to the east, except the little port of New Orleans, to the Appalachian Mountains, and all the Spanish Florida in exchange for Cuba, which Britain had captured during the war, as well as Canada. Great Britain now controlled all the landmass east of the Mississippi River. Britain was hoping to obtain the Louisiana Territory as well, but through a secret treaty, France gave the land to Spain so it would not be taken to Britain. Also, the French felt pretty bad because they convinced the Spanish to join them, and the Spanish had lost Florida. Managing a new empire, following the end of the French and Indian War, Great Britain found itself having to manage double the amount of land it had originally had claimed, all the way to the Mississippi. The British also were displeased by the colonists' refusal to stop trading with the enemy while the Redcoats were fighting a war the colonists had started. In addition to all this, they faced a massive national debt that needed to be paid. Regulating the colonies. George Grenville was charged with paying down the tremendous debt incurred in defending the colonies during the French and Indian War. Great Britain saw nothing wrong with requiring the American colonies to pay a small portion of the fees that they incurred for their defense. The Sugar Act was passed to help defray the cost of empire. Now, this was an indirect tax because it only affected a few people that were in the trade of dealing with sugar, while also taking aim at the smugglers. It lowered the duty from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon on foreign molasses imported into the colonies. This molasses was used to distill rum in New England. It also increased the restriction on colonial commerce and put a higher import taxes on non-British textiles, coffee, and indigo, as well as Madeira Canary wines. It also banned the importation of foreign rum and French wines. So this directly affected the smugglers, and they didn't like it because there's also going to be more enforcement to it. New Englanders, predominantly those colonists, actively opposed to the Sugar Act. They protested by boycotting British-made goods and also forming protests and attacking any kind of tax offices. The colonists believed that they were part of a special relationship with the king and that Parliament had no power over them. Parliament later would get rid of the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 was passed by Parliament to raise revenue in America by requiring tax stamp paper for legal documents, publications, and playing cards. Of course, basically almost anything that was made out of paper would have to be taxed. Newspapers, marriage certificates, and so on. This is a direct tax because it affects everybody. And Americans posed this as taxation without representation and prevented its enforcement. A writ of assistance was a general search warrant issued to custom officials in America. Basically, it is a blanket warrant. They could go in there and look for anything. It was never specific. James Otis Jr. of Boston called the writs of assistance instruments of slavery. Colonial reactions. The Stamp Act Congress. An October 1765 meeting of delegates sent by 9 colonies held in New York City, they adopted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting that the Stamp Act and other taxes imposed on the colonists without their consent given through their colonial legislatures were unconstitutional. No taxation without representation stated that the Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. due to there was no sitting members from the colonies in Parliament. They petitioned against the Stamp Act, repeal of the Stamp Act. Eventually, Parliament repealed the act while issuing the Declaratory Act, which affirmed their right to tax the colonies. After the fall of Grenville, the British Parliament and King formed a series of new governments, the latest during this time with William Pitt as Prime Minister. In his ministry, Charles Townsend became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, similar to our Secretary of the Treasury. Townsend also tried to repay the debt incurred in the 7 Years' War. The goal of the Townsend Duty Act was to pay the cost of the government by imposing new duties or external taxes in the colonies that Townsend believed the colonists would accept. New York Assembly in 1767, Parliament passed an act suspending the New York Assembly for failure to comply with the Quartering Act of 1765. New Yorkers saw this act as, once again, taxation without representation. Parliament saw a need to assert their power. New York gave in before the act was enacted, but the concern remained about imperial power. The duties were on a regular colonial import such as tea, paper, paint, lead, and glass. A new board of custom commissioners would be headquartered in Boston, home of many smugglers and the hotbed of protest, was to ensure collection of the duties. Colonists saw this as a threat, and they were concerned about corruption to pay governors and judges who would support Parliament. Colonists feared the Townsend Act was the first step towards greater British interference in colonial affairs. They formed boycotts of British goods, and British manufacturing was hurt because British exports were taxed. The colonial shipbuilding industry was not hurt, so it wasn't affected by the act. And the Townsend Acts would be repealed of all the taxes except the tax on tea. The first bloodshed. The Battle of Golden Hill occurred in New York City, where Liberty Boys kept on directing Liberty poles. Later on, soldiers would come and knock them down. On January 18, 1770, a group of patriots caught 2 British soldiers. 20 British troops were sent to rescue their comrade at Golden Hill. As more troops arrived, they turned on the crowd and attacked. Both sides were seriously hurt. The Boston Massacre. After months of increasing friction between townspeople and the British troops stationed in the city, erupted on March 5, 1770, when rowdies outside the Boston Custom House began taunting a sentry. The sentry requested reinforcements. One thing led to another, and what the colonists were doing was throwing them not with nice snowballs, but snowballs that were hidden with broken glass, nails, and everything else. And then all of a sudden, fire came out, or a command thought to be fired, and the redcoats fired into the mob. 5 Bostonians were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African American and Native American blood, and 8 were wounded. Paul Revere, the silversmith, would engrave what you saw right there in the slide of the Boston Massacre. Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberty successfully spread propaganda that depicted the event as a massacre in Boston by bloodthirsty British regulars against innocent colonial civilians. John Adams would successfully defend the British soldiers and Captain John Carter of the massacre, leaving doubt whether Carter actually gave the command to fire. Following the massacre, Parliament repealed the Townsend Acts, all except the tax on tea, and after that there was peace for at least 2 years. The burning of the Gatsby. The Gatsby was a customs vessel that had become stuck on a sandbar while pursuing a supposed smuggler. Colonists rowed to the Gatsby and set her aflame. An investigation would be called off because of the lack of witnesses. Well, I didn't see anything. In response, the Committee of Correspondence was organized by Samuel Adams and others to improve communication between the Patriot colonists. The Boston Tea Party. Lord North attempted to lower the tax on tea while requiring that only British tea be purchased. In addition to the Tea Act of 1773, was supposed to bail out the struggling East India Company. Colonists feared that allowing one monopoly would paved way for even more. The Boston Tea Party resulted when patriot colonists in Boston, Massachusetts, dressed as Indians, boarded 3 British ships and dumped the tea from 342 chests of the East India Company into Boston Harbor. Interesting to note that the first NFL football team in Boston was called the Boston Redskins, who would later move to Washington. The Coercive Acts. The British responded to the Boston Tea Party by passing the Coercive Acts, known as the Untitled Acts, by the colonies. The Coercive Act legislation passed by Parliament in 1774 was actually a series of acts, including the Boston Port Act. This closed the port of Boston until the city paid for the dumped tea. The Administration of Justice Act offered lenient treatment to government officials who killed a colonist while performing their duties. Government officials would stand trial in Great Britain. This made colonists fear increased violence at the hands of British soldiers, also provided for the trial of civil cases without a jury, and of course made them angry because John Adams had proved that you could get a fair trial in Boston due to the Boston Massacre. The Boston, Massachusetts Government Act drastically changed the Massachusetts colonial charter. It allowed the Crown to appoint the sheriffs who named juries in Massachusetts. It effectively took away the right of colonists to elect their own legislatures. And the New Quartering Act allowed British troops to be lodged in any inhabited building or in citizens' homes if necessary. This was a direct violation in the British Bill of Rights of quartering troops in peacetime. The First Continental Congress. Meeting of 55 delegates in Philadelphia from most of the colonies, Georgia was absent, was held in 1774 in response to the Coercive Acts. The Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. They turned the Coercive Acts unconstitutional, advised the people to arm, and called for economic sanctions against Britain, which declared the Coercive Acts null and void, were approved. They also adapted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Only a minority of delegates was willing to go to war with Britain at this time. They agreed to establish a Continental Association to put economic pressures on Britain to repeal its objectionable measures. The Congress also wrote addresses to the King, the people of Britain, and the American people. Patrick Henry of Virginia said, "I am not a Virginian, but an American," at the First Continental Congress. They decide that they will meet 1 year later to see if their demands had been met, or at least talked about. The bold talk of war. Patrick Henry of Virginia, that you see in the painting before you, and the House of Burgesses, the oldest colonial assembly, stood up and said, "I do not know what course others will take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." By mid-1775, King and Parliament had lost total control of the colonies. In Boston, General Gage warned that armed conflict would unleash the halls of civil war. Major John Pitcairn, under his command, an army officer, agreed along with Lord Sandwich, head of the British Navy, that the rebels were wrong and disciplined and cowardly, and by burning 2 or 3 of their towns, everything will be set right. The American Revolution was a war for independence, but it also grew out of a larger regional and global context. During the American Revolutionary War, many colonists attempted to remain neutral, although they were sometimes forced to choose a side. Those who sided with Britain in the conflict were known as Loyalists or Tories, sometimes suffered at the hands of those who supported independence. On the other hand, pro-independence patriots or Whigs were faced with harassment or trouble from Loyalists or British soldiers. The American Revolutionary War was part of a larger global conflict between Great Britain and France. The newly emerging United States benefited greatly from anti-British sentiment in France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The revolution begins. Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. General Gage was under orders in the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Dartmouth, to use force if necessary, to seize weapons at a supply depot in Concord before it could be used against them, and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. When the Boston Committee of Public Safety got wind of this, they sent Paul Revere and William Dawes to alert the countryside that the Redcoats were coming. Thanks to the alert, the Redcoats were met in Lexington by colonial militiamen under the command of Captain John Parker. British Major Pitcairn ordered the militia to be surrounded and disarmed. He used a lot of foul language in ordering that order. The shot that heard around the world rang out. No one knows who fired the shot, but it ended up killing 8 of the militia, ending 10 more. The militia retreated, and the British then moved on to Concord. News of what happened at Lexington, militia and Minutemen from all the surrounding towns had marched towards Concord, and when the retreating column ran into the army, they were outflanked, outgunned, and scared. The Americans did not fight the British, but instead of forming an offensive line, the colonial militia used small squad company tactics to flank the British columns and inflict heavy damage, fighting behind trees and rocks. This style of flanking and shooting behind the trees, walls, etc., destroyed the British morale, and they broke ranks while retreating towards Lexington. The final battle casualties of Lexington and Concord, the first 2 battles of the American Revolution, resulted in a total of 273 British soldiers were dead, wounded, and missing, and nearly 100 American casualties of dead, wounded, and missing. The Second Continental Congress. An assemblage of delegates from all the colonies, this time including Georgia, convened in Independence Hall in Philadelphia in May of 1775, as they said they would do. After the outbreak of fighting in Massachusetts between the British and American forces, it became the national government until 1789, and in its early day, the Second Continental Congress did establish a post office system, established currency, and on May 24th, John Hancock was elected president of the Congress. George Washington, one of the most momentous decisions was choosing George Washington to lead the Continental Army. John Adams of Massachusetts nominated Washington as commander-in-chief because Washington was from a southern colony. The Second Continental Congress wrote the Olive Branch Petition, written largely by John Dickinson and adopted on July 5, 1775, as a last effort of peace that avowed Americans' loyalty to King George III and requested that he protect it from further aggressions. Congress continued military preparations, however, and the king never responded to the petition. Historians believe he didn't even bother to read it. The Declaration of Causes and the necessity of taking up arms was also written mainly by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and adopted the next day on July 6, 1775. It asserted that American patriots would die freemen rather than live as slaves, by which the Second Continental Congress justified its armed resistance against British measures. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In May, Britain sent 3 major generals to assist Gage in Boston: Sir William Howe, Sir Henry Clinton, and General John Burgoyne. Gage declared martial law on June 12th and offered a pardon to any American returning their allegiance to the crown, except John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Any American in arms, or anyone who aided, would be considered a rebel and a traitor, which means they would be hanged. Breed's Hill. The Committee of Safety made a counter-move against Gage on June 15th, taking the high ground on Charlestown Peninsula overlooking Boston, moving to construct a redoubt on Breed's Hill. When the American position was discovered, the British immediately would fire from their ships in Boston Harbor, but Gage had to wait for favorable tides before landing. General Howe versus Colonel William Prescott. General Howe, with 2,400 British troops, engaged the 1,600 Americans under Colonel William Prescott. The British believed by once they unfurl the flags and start marching up, it would scare the bejesus out of the colonists and they would retreat. Prescott gave the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the white of their eyes," and they were able twice to repel the British troops. Only when their supply of gunpowder gave out did the Americans retreat to Bunker Hill before being routed by the British, who decided not to proceed to Cambridge. Although technically a British victory, they suffered 1,054 casualties, including many officers, while the Americans suffered 100 dead, 267 wounded, and 30 were taken as prisoner. A British officer would remark, "With another such victory would have ruined us." Washington would reach Cambridge on July 3rd and formally took command of the army of 14,500. Also assisting him would be Benedict Arnold, bringing the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Independence. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. A 66-page pamphlet written by Thomas Paine argued that the fault of the American Revolution lay at the feet of King George III and his advisors, and that the colonies, he pointed out, of the absurdity of having a continent governed by an island. He attacked George III, the royal brute of England, for troublesome measures against the colonies, flayed the monarchical system of government, and demonstrated that a balanced government could be achieved without a king or a noble class, which America did not have of any. The colonies need to form their own nation and should consider independence. This popular pamphlet helped convince many patriots to move towards openly supporting independence, where before they were fighting as their rights as British citizens. With three months, 150,000 copies of Common Sense was circulating throughout the colonies and the world. Breaking the bonds of empire. The victory at Moore's Creek Bridge, along with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, would be crucial in moving towards declaring independence. Already, 90 local governments, towns, and colonial legislatures issued declarations of independence by the summer of 1776. Momentum began to build in the Continental Congress. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania was the only one really to voice caution and would refuse to vote for independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia moved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. At first, 6 colonies were not ready to declare independence. A committee of 5 was formed to write the Declaration of Independence. The committee was comprised of Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Adams from Massachusetts, and Robert Livingston of New York. Adams convinced Jefferson that he should write the draft, that he was a better writer than he. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration had a list of charges against the actions of King George III that had led to the Revolution. In conclusion, it declared that the colonies were free and independent of British rule and were now a League of United States. It ended with, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." On July 2nd, 1776, to renounce the colony's allegiance to the British government, 12 voted for independence. New York abstained, claiming that they had not heard from their assembly. The next 2 days were used to debate the actual Declaration of Independence. On July 4th, 1776, after Congress finally debated the final form of the Declaration, making several changes before approving the final version without dissent, New York again abstained. Jefferson's eloquent and inspiring statements of the contract theory of government makes the document one of the world's great state papers. Jefferson took many of the ideas from George Mason and John Locke. You remember, Locke was the one that said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed property to pursuit of happiness. John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, would be the first to sign the document claiming, "The British ministry can read that name without spectacles. Let them double the reward," referring to the price on his head already. So this becomes the birthday of the United States of America, July 4th, 1776.
Burgoyne was burdened by the heavy baggage train carrying the clothing of several officers' wives and of Burgoyne's mistress, which bogged down by the lack of adequate roads, which he had to chop out of the forest. Burgoyne, feeling trapped by a force 3 times the size of his own 7,000 men, and suffering many casualties, surrendered at Saratoga on October 17, 1777, to General Horatio Gates. Gates took full credit for the victory, although in reality it was due to the heroics of General Benedict Arnold, who had rallied the troops to victory. Arnold was shot in the leg during the battle. Burgoyne's remaining 5,700 troops, laying down their arms, were marched back to Boston with the promise that they would not fight again. The victory gave Americans a much-needed morale boost, proved that they could withstand the best England had to offer, and forced Britain to seriously reflect on the war. The alliance with France. The victory of the Americans at Saratoga was a turning point. Success finally convinced the French, who had lost 4 wars to the British in the previous 80 years, and also lost more territory as a result of those wars, now decided to sign first the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which recognized the de facto independence of the United States and established a strict commercial treaty between the two nations. Next came the Treaty of Alliance on February 6, 1778, which promised mutual military support in case fighting should break out between the French and the British forces. As a result of the treaty signing of Amity and Commerce. In this treaty, the French guaranteed that we'd fight until America was independent and neither side could leave the war without the consent of the other. As a result of this treaty, staying in 1779 and the British in 1781, but also allied themselves with the French and the support of the Americans. The Battle of Yorktown. Following this was a decisive naval battle, with the French under de Grasse driving off the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay region. British Admirals Graves and Hood would go back to New York. Cornwallis was then besieged by a Franco-American force of 16,000 troops. Back in New York, the British admirals were deciding on how and when to rescue Cornwallis, when then on October 17th, a British fleet finally set out of New York to rescue Cornwallis, but it was too late. Cornwallis was outnumbered, outgunned, and was running out of food. He finally surrendered his army of 7,157 on October 19, 1781. Cornwallis would not attend the surrender ceremony, claiming he was too ill. Washington designated General Benjamin Lincoln on the white horse in the center of the painting as one to accept the submission of a subordinate British officer, who at first tried to snub Washington and hand over Cornwallis's sword to the French General Rochambeau. He pointed immediately to Washington as being the supreme commander of the Allied forces. The surrender of Yorktown ended the fighting in the war for the American independence and the Americas, except for some minor fights in the South. But other battles still went on overseas. The Treaty of Paris. As soon as the war had begun, the United States sent diplomats to England to work to secure a peace. Although the negotiators fluctuated throughout the war, they were led by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. As soon as the war in the New World ended, it became obvious to the diplomats that France and Spain were not interested in ending the war. England's army was defeated, but not her navy nor her people. France wanted England beaten and was unwilling to broker negotiations with it for the United States. Spain had entered a war against England, but had never sent military aid formally to the American colonies. By late 1781, after the news of the defeat at Yorktown arrived, the British government began to take measures to end the fighting in North America against the United States so it could concentrate the resources on fighting their global war with the French and the Spanish. Franklin entered the negotiations with Great Britain in 1782. A committee of prominent Americans, John Adams, John Jay, and Benjamin Franklin, would secure the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which brought the end to the war. Under the treaty, the United States benefited most, although the lack of clarity concerning the new nation's northern and southern boundaries led to trouble in the future. The British agreed to recognize American independence, the Mississippi River as the western boundary of the United States, giving up claims to lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Native Americans who had claims over these lands, once again, were not consulted.